Welcome to Civics in a Year, the podcast that makes civic literacy fast, accessible, and surprisingly engaging. In just 10 minutes an episode, we'll tackle one of 250 essential questions about American democracy, how it works, why it matters, and what it means for you. Whether you're a student, a teacher, or just someone who wants to better understand your country and your rights, you're in the right place. Civics in a Year is powered by the Civic Literacy Curriculum from the Center for American Civics and is produced in partnership with the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership at Arizona State University. Today's guest is Dr. Sidney Milkis. Sidney Milkis is the White Burkett Miller Professor of Politics at the University of Virginia and interim director of the Program on Constitutionalism and Democracy. He is an award-winning educator and a leading scholar of the American presidency, political parties, and democratic development. Professor Milkis is the author or co-author of numerous influential books on American politics, including works on the presidency, reform movements, and the evolution of constitutional democracy. He is also the co-founder of UVA's Project on Democracy and Capitalism, which examines the relationship between self-government and markets. Welcome back to Civics in a Year. If you have not listened to the previous episode with Dr. Milkis on the progressive era, I really think that you should. I could listen all day long, but we're kind of moving forward here to the New Deal. Sure. And Dr. Milkis, again, thank you so much. I love talking about Teddy Roosevelt, and now we get to talk about Franklin Roosevelt. So what did the New Deal do to realign party coalitions in the 1930s?
Yeah. Well, thank you for saying you could listen to me all day. Academics don't hear that very often. I really appreciate it, Liz. So as we talked about the progressive era, we said both parties were affected by this more direct form of democracy, where presidents become the major representative and the appeal is directly to public opinion. That affected both the Democratic and the Republican parties, but it's neither party completely embraces it because it weakens their organizations. And in particular, the Republican Party resists it. And so we get a reaction to the progressive era in the 1920s. As the president-elected in 1920, Warren Harding, put it, there's a return to normalcy. And a lot of things we talked about that were prevalent in the 19th century, efforts to restore power to the states and localities, put boundaries around the national government, restore the authority of states and localities in the party organization. That takes place in part during the 1920s. And so you have the Republican Party, neither party is really committed to the kind of progressivism we describe, big government, presidency, but the Republican Party particularly resists it. And Herbert Hoover, who's the third Republican president in the 1920s, is elected in 1928 with a campaign credo of, we have to advance rugged individualism. But that all changes with the Great Depression. And I don't know if your students can fathom what a bad, terrible episode this was. It was an unprecedented national emergency, national crisis in American politics. And I didn't live through it, but my dad did. And he regaled me with tales about 30% unemployment, over 50% in cities. The banking industry had shut down. The stock market had collapsed. And that created an opportunity for Franklin Roosevelt and the Democratic Party to become the vanguard of a major partisan realignment in American politics. The Republican Party had been the majority party since the Civil War, with the really important interruption, which we talked about in the previous segment, of Woodrow Wilson. So Franklin Roosevelt broke the two-term tradition, was elected to four terms. He'd probably still be president if he had not died in 1945. My mom told me that the American people had just grown so accustomed to Roosevelt being president that when he died, it just was a tremendous shock to the nation.
Yeah.
Roosevelt's long presidency in the midst of this domestic crisis, which then was reinforced by an international crisis, World War II, led to to a major realignment in American politics. And the Republican Party had been the dominant party since the Civil War. By the end of Roosevelt's presidency, he had forged with the help of labor unions and civil rights and the civil rights movement, he had forged a national Democratic majority, which would prevail up until the late 1960s. And this consolidated, if you will, Liz, the progressive ideal. And so what happened in the first 2 decades of the 20th century is really consolidated during the New Deal period. And we get the welfare state, we get the national security state, and at the top of that is this modern presidency, which now becomes not just an office, but an institution, because one of Franklin Roosevelt's reforms was to oversee the enactment of legislation which created the White House office, which I guess was made famous by a pretty popular television show called The West Wing.
Yes.
And then as part of that, and that was part of the executive office of the president, which included important staff agencies like the Office of Management and Budget, which is now very much in the news because it's a very important part of President Trump's program. So we get a consolidation of the presidency, which both Democrats and Republicans buy into. But for a long time, that the Democratic Party and its conception of the modern presidency, which is dedicated particularly to the welfare state. Social Security is at the center, the core program of the New Deal. It's still the largest program in American politics. So this leads to a major transformation from ideas that emphasize the importance of individual responsibility.
Dr. Milkis, we talked about Teddy Roosevelt, again, my favorite president to study. And now we're talking about Franklin Roosevelt, who in his own right is incredibly interesting. They had two very different techniques of talking to the public. Can you kind of talk about how media and what Teddy Roosevelt termed as the bully pulpit influenced political parties and the way they interact with people?
Yeah, the development of the mass media, Liz, is really a critical part of this development of the direct connection that's formed between the modern presidential office and public opinion. So that becomes the main focus rather than the political parties. And Roosevelt uses Franklin. I got to be careful. We got to talk about which Roosevelt we're talking about. And they were cousins, Franklin Roosevelt was Roosevelt's fifth cousin and was inspired by him and sought to complete this advance of progressivism that was interrupted by the 1920s. So an important part of this real democratic realignment, where the Democratic Party becomes established as the majority party till the late 60s, is Roosevelt's remarkable ability to communicate with the public. So Theodore Roosevelt had taken advantage of what he called the muckrakers, which was this investigative reporting that emerged with the explosion of popular magazines like McClure's during the Progressive era. And that's how he communicated with the public, through these stories talking about his what he wanted to accomplish and what his obstacles to that were. Franklin Roosevelt pioneered the technology of the radio, which was really the most important form of communication until the television came on board in the 1950s. And Calvin Coolidge had used the radio. He was the first one to use it, but mainly for formal speeches. What Franklin Roosevelt did, Liz, was to develop the fireside chat. And my dad talked about the fireside chats as well. Franklin Roosevelt gave 2 or 3 of these a year. And he did so when there was really a very important thing to talk about. My father said when he was given a fireside chat, everybody listened because they knew that they were going to hear something important. The first fireside chat was March 12th, 1933, and it was Roosevelt's first personal appeal to the American people about dealing with this great crisis of the Depression, and his topic in that first fireside chat was the bank crisis. There was a raid on the banks and the banking system was collapsed. And he declared a bank holiday and told the American people why he was going to call that. And that was the beginning of restoring confidence in the American people. And what was so important about these fireside chat, Liz, is that Roosevelt, if you listen to them, and your students can find them online, if you listen to them, you see it's almost like he's sitting in your living room talking to you. These are not, just as you and I are sitting here having this fun conversation about the progressive era and the New Deal. It was as though Franklin Roosevelt was having a direct conversation with the American people. And so he spoke in very plain but serious terms about the major developments that occurred during his presidency, ending, of course, with World War II.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that because I think the first time I experienced a presidential speech, or I mean, my generation's version of a fireside chat is listening to Reagan's Challenger speech because I was in elementary school. You know, we had watched the Challenger, and unfortunately, you know, watched the tragedy that it became.
Yeah.
And I remember watching that speech and feeling like President Reagan was speaking to me. So when you say that, I mean, that's kind of where I went is, and you know, we've listened to the fireside chats from Roosevelt in class, and that's such a powerful way to give information. I think today we take for granted we can get information quickly, like right at the touch of our hands. But you know, if we're talking about the 1930s and the 1940s, information didn't move as quickly. Do you think that mass media then, especially as Franklin Roosevelt used it, had an impact on how political parties then afterwards engaged with the public?
I do. And what I think it really accentuates, Liz, is this focus on the presidency. As
Mm-hmm.
you know, go back to Theodore Roosevelt's phrase, as a steward of the public welfare, because it's hard for Congress and it's difficult for party organization leaders to communicate with the public in that way. And so the development of the mass media, first with these popular magazines, then with the radio, then with television, and now with X, with the social with social media, it really it plays to the advantage of the presidency and has accentuated this change in our politics from where we started in the 19th century to now, where the main focus is not to the party system and to the Congress and the state governments, which were such a central part of the traditional party system. Now the main relationship, for better and worse, I think there's some problems with this. For better and worse, the main relationship of the American people with their government is through the presidency. And the president's almost become synonymous with government for a lot of people. And I think that's a problem, Liz, because I mean, there's great advantages to it. It's hard to see, for example, how, you know, you can think of the great triumphs of the modern presidency with Franklin Roosevelt, of course, addressing in a way that the people felt responsive to the Great Depression, our victory in World War II. Think of the civil rights movement that Lyndon Johnson advanced. You mentioned Ronald Reagan and our victory in the Cold War. These are great triumphs. But I think somewhat at the cost of the vitality of our democracy, because I don't think a large and diverse country of 300 million people can invest as much political trust as our citizenry has in the presidency in the White House and still say we have a vibrant form of self-government. I think the states and localities, the party organization played an important part of that. I'm a little biased towards this because my keep talking about my family, but my students my students like my stories about my family
I love them. They make it
so,
more relatable.
so much that you know I'm running out of family members to talk about in my class. But my grandfather, who owned a small grocery store in Jenkintown, Pennsylvania, outside of Philly, also was a Republican committeeman, which meant he was a local party leader who went out into the neighborhoods and really gave the Republican Party a name and a place, you know, a place that the people could identify in the neighborhoods. And when he passed, I found some letters that some Republican congressmen who were elected in 1974 against the Watergate scandal, thanking him for his help in connecting with the people and helping them politically survive the crisis. That kind of phenomenon, my grandfather out there in the neighborhoods, has really declined in American politics, Liz, and I think that's at the cost of the vibrancy of our democracy.
It's funny that you mentioned that because we just finished up a series on Alexis de Tocqueville, and and I had never read Democracy in America, and I learned so much. And one of the things that I learned is that, those politics should be local. Like that's where the power, comes from, and that's where change comes from. And I don't know if it's the advent of social media. This is a kind of big thought experiment for me. Is when did it all of a sudden become this national thing? Because I know, a lot of people vote in presidential elections, but they don't necessarily vote in their state and local elections. So it's been a theme in the most recent podcasts. And I'm glad that you mentioned it too, that local politics does matter. And, back in the days of our grandfathers and grandmothers and greats and whatever else, that was the way that things happened.
Yeah. I taught Tocqueville yesterday in my graduate class, and I also teach it in my undergraduate class. And you're right. His argument is that patriotism rises up from the provinces. People have to have a direct connection to the government and see it and participate in it for it really to mean something to them. And I think that begins to change dramatically with the New Deal. It's become even more pronounced. The changes become even pronounced with the 60s and 70s when the national government expands beyond matters of security to almost every feature of our life. The personal is now political. And there's reasons for that. But I think citizenship really was developed in American politics at the states and localities. These were the homes of these were the great schools of American democracy. And with their decline, and you're pointing to the lower turnout in congressional and local elections is really, really important. That was not the case in the 19th century when parties were strong. I think we have to figure out a way to revitalize the civic culture that was really cultivated by that kind of politics that Tocqueville talked about. Now, it was no golden age. We can't go back there, but there were certain things that were valuable in that kind of politics we need to think about revitalizing.
Dr. Milkis, I can talk to you forever. And I do want you to know now that I am going to be asking you to do more of these with me because it is, I appreciate that you talk about your family because it makes it relatable. And, these changes in political parties and, the episode we did before on the progressive era and the New Deal and kind of moving forward, those did change things. But especially in this America 250, I think that it all comes back to citizens and the things that we can do to make our, again, local, state, and our national government better and kind of, to take from the Constitution more perfect as we continue to move along. So genuinely, thank you so much. This has been so much fun.
Yeah, I love doing these things. In the summer, I do a summer institute here at UVA where we teach high school teachers about democracy and capitalism because I'm co-founder and co-director of a program on democracy and capitalism. And I love teaching. I love doing public events for people of your dad's generation, as I mentioned. But I also, another one of my favorite audiences is teachers, public school teachers.
Yes.
And
teachers rule.
Because they're teachers, they're so fun to teach, right?
Yes. That Summer Institute, is that something that teachers can find online? Because I am more than happy to put that in our show notes and make sure that, teachers know about that.
Yeah. And, we have an in-person Summer Institute, but we also put stuff online they would find valuable. Yeah, absolutely. I think you could find it all just by Googling. I'll see if I can find you a link. I'll send it to you. So you can.
And teachers, I will put that in show notes. As somebody, I've been to James Madison, I've been to Monticello, I've done these place-based professional developments, and I think UVA's campus is absolutely beautiful, but there's something about
I was
Yeah,
just going to
there's something
say,
about place-based PD that is just, I think, amazing.
yeah, I love doing it. It's a lot of fun.
Thanks for joining us on another episode of Civics in a Year. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe and share it with someone who cares about a constitutional republic as much as you do. For more episodes, resources, and updates, follow us on social media or visit us at civics.asu.edu. Make sure to check out the show notes for any relevant links. Special thanks to the United States Marine Band for their performance of the Stars and Stripes Forever. Let's keep building a stronger constitutional republic, one episode at a time.